Section 413, Control of Records. Records include but are not limited to data, internal audits, management reviews, corrective actions, and preventative actions. You must have a procedure to address how records are identified, collected, indexed, accessed, filed, stored, maintained, and disposed of. The procedure shall protect and back up records stored electronically and prevent unauthorized access to the amendment of records. Storing records in your locked facility generally covers this requirement for paper systems. For electronic systems, you could prevent unauthorized amendment of records by using logins and passwords. Positional access controls, such as separate server or folder locations, which only allows laboratory access, and functional access controls, such as read-only or read-write. You must have a set retention time. The standard requires 5 years in 413.3b, but know your regulatory requirements. Some drinking water regulations require 10 years. Records must be legible and stored safely. Can I go paperless? I like to start with a cautionary tale called the Never Never event in Kansas. The Kansas Department of Health's homegrown LIMS system was backed up to 2 separate servers in 2 separate buildings on the state campus. They would never lose the data from their LIMS system. And then one horrible stormy night, the server at the laboratory and the 2 separate backup servers in 2 separate locations all crashed and the LIMS system was decimated. The original husk was located, but the customizations that had been made over the years and all of the data were gone. Fortunately, the lab was still heavily dependent on paper and was able to recreate the most recent data in the LIMS system and eventually move forward. So can you go paperless? Maybe, but it can be more difficult than you think. Some areas of the laboratory lend themselves to this more than others. For example, microbiology is extremely difficult due to the sheer volume of quality control records. If you consider sampling, not everyone is comfortable taking electronics into the field. Consider, do you have room to store paper? Is there sufficient server space, or do you need to use cloud-based technology? A LIMS system can assist with going paperless, but would not necessarily be required. But with any electronic system, record backups become extremely important. We must ensure that all staff have access to tablets, laptops, computers, at the location that work is done. And if you're going to keep scans of a paper document, check with state requirements for what is considered an original. Generally, a scan will suffice, but not always. The goal for record management is document traceability. We need to understand all the contributing factors that result in the release of the final test report to the customer. You must be able to have an audit trail for all of your data, and you must maintain training and staff records. Common deficiencies include retaining records of original observations. Don't write things down on scratch paper or post-it notes and then throw it away. Do not capture original observations in your calculator, perform statistical measurements, and then record the resultant as your original observation. Analytical records must contain, quote, sufficient information to facilitate, if possible, identification of factors affecting the uncertainty and to enable the test or calibration to be repeated under conditions as close as possible to the original. ISO 17025-41321. This is somewhat subjective, but the T&I Quality Systems Expert Committee is currently writing a guidance document for this. Data must be recorded at the time it is observed. For example, you can't check all of the pHs for a batch of metal samples and then record it later. Sampling times must be filled out when the sample is taken. Observed data must be linked to the specific task at hand. You can't make a blanket statement at the top of a bench sheet that all samples were checked for chlorine and it wasn't found. You can, however, do a check mark next to each sample in a column labeled "No Chlorine." Mistakes cannot be obliterated. Never use a pencil. You can't erase things. Whiteout is never an option. We want to make sure we single line, date, and initial, and make notation of why it was changed if it wasn't a simple flub of the numbers. Section 413.3 is exceptionally long, detailed, and is a common source of deficiencies. A is the laboratory shall establish a record-keeping system that allows the history of the sample and associated data to be readily understood through the documentation. The laboratory shall retain all records for a minimum of 5 years from generation of the last entry in the records. Records shall be available to the accreditation body. Records that are stored only on electronic media shall be supported by the hardware and software necessary for their retrieval. Access to archived information shall be documented with an access log. If you archive data, such as boxing it up and storing it in a storage room, then when the data is accessed, you must keep a log of who accessed it, why, and when it was returned. For example, you might keep a simple log on the door to the room or on the box or filing cabinet. With Section 413.3F and the additional requirements, you'll see that this is also quite long and a common area of deficiencies. All raw data, whether hard or electronic, must be maintained. A written description or reference to the specific method used, the laboratory sample ID code, the date of analysis, and the time of analysis required if the holding time is 72 hours or less, or when time-critical steps are included in the analysis, such as extractions and incubations. Continuing under F, instrumentation, identification, and instrument operating conditions and parameters must be maintained. All manual calculations. The analyst or operator initials, signature, or electronic identification. Sample preparation records, including cleanup, separation protocols, incubation periods, or subcultures, ID codes, volumes, weights, instrument printouts, meter readings, calculations, and reagents. You must have the test results, and there must be a record of standard and reagent origin, receipt, preparation, and use. Calibration criteria, frequency, and acceptance criteria must be linked to data. Data and statistical calculations, review, confirmation, interpretation, assessment, and reporting conventions must be maintained. Quality control protocols and assessment. Electronic data security, such as software documentation and verification, software and hardware audits, backups, and records of any changes to automated data entries. Method performance criteria, including expected quality control requirements. All proficiency test results. Records of demonstrations of capability for each analyst, and a record of names, initials, and signatures for all individuals who are responsible for signing or initialing any laboratory record. Records must be legible. They don't do anyone any good if you can't read them, and you must also address the potential transfer of ownership. A simple statement in the quality manual handles this. For municipal laboratories, generally the city will maintain the records for as long as needed with no problems. Remember, records must be maintained for a minimum of 5 years, whether you remain in business or not. The record retention policy does not necessarily need to define every type of record that needs to be maintained. The assessor will verify that required records are maintained. It should, at a minimum, address retention time of records, how to make corrections, and what laboratories will do if they are closed and sold. If individual components of the standard are not included in the procedure, the assessor will make sure that practices in the laboratory are being performed correctly. For example, the laboratory may not actually archive records and keep them active for the full time frame stated in the quality manual. If this is the case, then an archive log would not be required. Generally, requirements for the types of records to be maintained are spread out over the quality systems documents. When looking for non-conforming procedures, generally they don't include information such as retention times, corrections, or what to do if the laboratory closes. Common deficiencies include obliterations. Remember to single line date and initial all corrections. Records must be maintained that need to be maintained. Don't throw away those post-it notes, and make sure you keep that field sampling data when it was written down. Records of observations must be made at the time they are done. Lining down for preservation checks on a sample custody form rather than marking each preservation check as it's done is a common place for deficiencies.